Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill here, busting myths, taking names. You know, we do so many interesting things on this show. I love this show. I love how we approach things. I love everything about it. And of course, I'm the creator of it. So I have a huge ego. But we have today someone on the line who's doing extremely interesting work in a field where I think most of the public doesn't realize that there are historians employed. And that is in the government, but more specifically in the military, and even more specifically than that, in the United States Navy. So please welcome to the show Dr. Heather Haley. Dr. Haley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first I have to ask you, do you have a rank?
No, I'm a civilian. What I usually tell people is I'm a historian for the United States Navy. That's the easiest way to say it. Otherwise, my long title is historian, history advisory group, histories branch, Naval History and Heritage Command for the United States Navy. So I just say that I'm a historian for the United States Navy.
Oh, I like that long title, but also you have something to tell us that's never happened on this show before.
Yes.
You have a statement that you have to make, so please go ahead.
So, when you work for the government and you do podcasts such as this, we have little disclaimers. So, I will say that the themes, opinions, thoughts of myself are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect that of the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, or the federal government at large.
Okay.
So even though I'm going to be talking about my job, should this conversation, I don't know, get into different territory, again, thoughts and opinions that I express are mine alone, essentially.
Well, if it were the Cold War, we'd have to worry about the Ruskies and everything, but I don't know. I
Right,
don't. I don't know who we have to worry
exactly.
about now.
Yeah,
But
I'm not sure.
but I love the fact that you have to have a disclaimer. I just
Yes.
love that. I hope you have a business card, and the back of the business card has a huge long disclaimer. Don't ask me how to sink submarines and stuff like that.
Right. In fact, I wouldn't know anyway. So,
Oh, never admit stuff like that. Always
yes.
say you know. Yeah. You know, but you can't say.
Right, right.
Well, we're going to have Dr. Haley back on the show again to talk about her specific research, her scholarly research. But today I thought I'd ask her and enlighten you what someone, in the Navy who's a historian does. So let me first ask you, Dr. Haley, why does the Navy hire civilian historians?
Great question. Civilians have a really interesting perspective to bring, particularly if they are like me and have no military service background. Now, I'm a military brat. I come from a family of two sailors. My sister was also a sailor, and my husband was a sailor. So, no pressure on me. So, I like to say that I got into the Navy just kind of in a roundabout sort of way. But civilians don't have the, I guess you could say, attachment to the service as someone who was formerly in as a veteran or currently serving. Although we do have some or have had people in the past who were either reservists or as veterans, employed with the United States Navy or with the Army Center for Military History, which is based in DC. And so hiring civilians is, I think, one of the things that brings, again, like I said, different perspectives because we haven't served. And so being able to distance yourself from the content. And again, when I was thrown into my job, they gave me a few battles of Guadalcanal in 1942 to study and write some pieces about. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into at the time because I was a brand new employee. And so it's also a learning experience for us as well. I mean, it is one of the paths military historians might take with the Navy, the Army, Air Force, Marines all have history offices.
Wow. So the Navy and the military in general, they want that. They want, if you will, outsiders.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Particularly with different research fields. So I think I was about 6-ish months away from graduating with my PhD in just 20th century American history broadly. But my dissertation research had to do with gay liberation and the military right at the moment when the lavender scare in the federal government, which we can talk about it at another time, was coming to an end with the federal government. And so the military had the opportunity to change course as well to coincide with that of the federal government. And so with my research focus being on LGBT studies and gender and sexuality, the Navy was very much interested in hiring me because that is almost a research thread not yet kind of touched upon within the Navy. It's a relatively new field in academia broadly, at least within the last 40 years. I know that doesn't sound like that very old, but to some of us, it's still quite new. So the Naval History and Heritage Command didn't have anyone who focused on that in particular. And then when I get there, I'm thrown into commemorations and anniversaries and wonderful things like that. I do a very well-rounded kind of focus when it comes to my work.
Yeah, and I suppose our listeners should know that, being asked to work outside your field, outside your specific research field, first of all, you don't, you still have all the skills that you learned, the training and the research skills are all the same. But being asked to work outside your research field sort of gives you not only new perspective, but new energy into doing stuff. For instance, I'm a British and Irish historian, yet during this show, I've fallen back in love with American history.
Yeah.
So it must be fascinating for you to come from your background, your research background, and then say, oh, we need 500 words on the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Mhm. Right. Exactly. And this would be an interesting question for you, but the average age of your listeners, do you know that data?
No, I don't know. I wish I did know, but when I was starting the show, I asked the experts about this, and they said, no, that would be creepy. That
Right.
would be,
That's
J.
fair.
Edgar Hoover-ish to do that. So, I don't know.
That's fair. I ask because I get the sense that your audience would probably trend toward a younger crowd. And if that's true, your point is well taken that while my research interests are almost kind of niche, when I'm given something that is outside of my direct expertise, it reminds me very much of being in school when you are required to write papers on things that you are not an expert on. And so that is a skill that you learn in grad school that you can literally take into the workplace, particularly if you work for a historian's office, whether it's a historian's office at the state level, municipal level, or even federally, because even some of the larger departments, like the Department of Agriculture, has a history office.
Wow.
Yeah, so even though you might be writing something now, speaking to your audience, if you're writing something now that you have no idea what the content is starting out, like that is commonplace. And that's okay because that's where not only are you as the researcher learning something, but you are also imparting knowledge on new generations, or in my case, hopefully current superior officers, admirals, because learning never ends.
Oh, well, that's absolutely true. But let's talk about the workplace. I think that most people will only think of historians in the military and in the government as tour guides and public historians at military parks and stuff. They'll be amazed at what an archival military historian does. So, what do you actually do kind of on a day to day basis?
Anyone who meets me in person will know that I will not shut up about how much I love my job. I really do.
Well, that's great.
I really do. I used to absolutely loathe research and writing. And it's not until you get better at it that you like it, that you truly enjoy doing the work. My job, there's a lot to it. Most of it centers on my own research and writing projects. So, again, when I got hired, they threw our commemorations list at me and said, here, go. And essentially, my superior and a bunch of other folks came together and decided these are the, I don't know, 30 to 50 things we're going to commemorate this year. And so, like I said, the first year I started was in 2022. And so it was the 80th anniversary of Guadalcanal. And so they said, well, you're new. You don't really necessarily have the knowledge of, Navy battles. So let's throw you in there and see what you come up with. Well, come to find out, to speak to your earlier question, having new perspectives also allows fresh eyes to see something others might not. So, for example, I'm taking the pieces that I wrote on Guadalcanal, certain battles, and I'm analyzing it from the perspective of radar, which was very, very new technology. And I plan on writing a small kind of pamphlet. They're usually between 80 and 100 pages long. They're published internally and distributed to the fleet for anyone within the United States Navy who is interested in wanting a physical copy. Otherwise, all of our publications are online and you can access them at any time. But what I want to do with this research is analyze Guadalcanal from the perspective that perhaps leadership didn't use technology to its fullest extent possible because radar was very new. There was concern at the time, internal memoranda that I've seen, which is part of my job as well, as being able to look through archives, both here at the Washington Navy Yard or in College Park, Maryland, and sifting through those after action reports and finding out, oh, well, you didn't use radar when you could have. Like, why was that? And so, again, I have no expertise in this, but because this was given to me right when I started, I just ran with it. And my supervisor really liked the idea because it's fresh. It talks about technology, especially in this 2024 world that we're now in, with technology constantly changing. And so using this historical example to explain current issues, perhaps with AI, I'm not sure. I know nothing internal in terms of, I focus on history, not the present. But
Yeah.
my history speaks to the present, and that's essentially what my work does. Only on very rare occasions do I have to present kind of to the world, and that's, maybe once a year, twice a year. And the only other thing that I do in my group is respond to requests for information. They love acronyms in the military, so they're called RFIs, and they could be from anyone. They could be from a civilian, they could be from a four-star admiral. If that is the case, I have to drop what I'm doing and answer the question or find the answer, right? Which is really great for me. Again, this is like the perfect job for someone who doesn't have that kind of internal knowledge. So that way it allows me to go and dig, which also allows me a better familiarity with our records on the Navy Yard. That's generally what I do. The Naval History and Heritage Command is an Echelon 2 command, which means we report to the
Number two.
number 2. Yeah, we report to the
Echelon 2, number 2.
we
Okay.
report to the Chief of Naval Operations. So in the federal government, they do absolutely love like a job tree where you see who's connected with whom. And we are connected directly to the Chief of Naval Operations. So sometimes the Secretary of the Navy asks questions. So, for example, with my expertise in LGBT gay liberation era studies, every year when LGBT month in June happens, I help them condense kind of we call it bottom line up front bluffs. So I kind of condense the history of gay liberation into like a paragraph. So that way the Navy, the one thing that I'm thrilled about with the Navy is how inclusive the Navy has become and is trending toward. And one of the ways in which they do that is by commemorating and acknowledging these big months, right? Like we have African American History Month happening in February. Women's, I want to say, is in September, but we also just celebrated the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, had its 75th anniversary this last year. So there's any number of things that kind of come down the line that we spend a couple of days researching, diving into, finding answers, and then providing the sources. So that way, should someone, come knocking and asking, they can speak to where this data came from.
Well, that leads me right to this next question. I mean, you must have access to the greatest archival material in the world, given your field. You're able to work with the primary sources in your field damn near every day. And I hope that the access and availability are good. I'm sure there are a lot of things that are classified. It just amazes me. It's as if when I was doing my work on parliamentary history in the 19th century, I was actually working in Parliament at the same time and just could go to other. So that must be. I mean, we're all jealous of what you have in your office.
Right. The Naval and History and Heritage Command has not only its library, which has over 10,000 volumes, and it is the library for the Navy. So anyone active duty in the Navy can come and borrow a book if they wanted to. And we're constantly adding to our collections. In terms of the manuscripts we do have can vary from a ship's history, which they create the ship itself. The sailors and their public affairs officer kind of create that themselves, and then we store them. We also have papers from famous admirals. So I've been lucky enough to wade through boxes and boxes and boxes of materials that were kept by Admiral Zumwalt, who I'm working on my Society for Military History presentation, which is going to be about Zumwalt and his relationship to women's rights movement. And that's going to be part of a larger pamphlet that I'm working on for the United States Navy. And it's focusing on women in the 20th century Navy. So I'm working through his papers. We have those, but sometimes, usually after, I want to say after a certain period, and you'll forgive me, I'm not an archivist, so I don't have these
Yeah,
numbers
yeah, yeah, yeah,
memorized.
yeah.
However, after a certain period, we transfer files to the National Archives up in Maryland, which is not super far. It's about 20 miles from the Washington Navy Yard, because everything that we provide is going to be more recent. So I want to say NARA 1, which is located in downtown DC, that is up to or about the Great Depression. So early American history is stored in Washington, DC. And then pretty much when you get into World War II, then you're moving out into territory of Maryland, the NARA 2 location. All of that is to say, I have the ability, because of where I live, to be able to access not only our archives, but archives with the Naval or with the National Archives out in Maryland, which is really nice.
Again, just jealous, jealous, jealous. But you know, the other thing is, I think we civilian historians are generally overawed at the extent to which the military branches do real historical work. You mentioned these after action analyses and all that. I mean, I briefly learned about this while I was doing my doctorate, and one of my friends was doing military history, and he was analyzing after action analyses as historical texts in their own right, blah, 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 blah. I am fascinated by this, and I think our listeners will be stunned to hear how much self analysis the military does, almost to a navel gazing level. And yes, I prepared that joke for a naval historian.
Yes.
But it'd be cool to hear how all that works. I mean, we tend to think that the military budget goes all to weapons, but there must be a large percentage of the budget, relatively speaking, that goes to doing these after action analyses.
Yes.
How does it work?
Again, I am not familiar with current policy in terms of how those after action reports kind of funnel down the line.
Oh, and you probably couldn't tell us anyway
Right.
because they would be classified. Yeah.
Yes.
But after action analyses in the Korean War is probably safe.
Yes, very true. I'm glad you're asking this question because there are quite a number of them, particularly, say, most of the Pacific War, I would say most, are going to be available online with the National Archives and
World War II Pacific.
World War II
Right.
Pacific. And of course, because we're Navy, we're more familiar with the Pacific War than the war in Europe, right? But that's not to say that we didn't get involved in Operation Torch, which was the operation in which the Navy assisted in landing troops in Africa. So your audience can't see this, but I'm holding up one of the pamphlets that we just came out with last year called Contested Logistics: Sustaining the Pacific War. And this is one of the manuscripts that my team and I created with my boss, Tim Francis, and my colleague, Peter Lubke. We were asked, this is another one of the tasks that we're given, right? Is we were asked to analyze these after action reports. How does the Navy sustain a war during a war, right? Because you've got items, you got to get stuff from the mainland out to the Pacific, where, yes, at the time we had Hawaii as a territory, but that's a little unsustainable. So, how do we get items from the mainland to each individual ship? And that was asked of us by someone, I want to say out in the Pacific Fleet, because these are all things that the Navy needs to be ready for in the event of something happening in the future. So they wanted to see how they did it in the Pacific. And so they asked me to write on Bora Bora, which is a very small island in the Southeast Pacific. Essentially, if you were to look at a globe and just take Hawaii and go directly south, you would hit Bora Bora at some point. But Bora Bora was the first forwarding base. And so they had to build a base from scratch. And so I was able to look at reports from all the way down to the minutia of, I need 70 cases of Coca-Cola and 100 cases of cigarettes, because this is what our sailors need, right? And so these are the records that we're going through. And like I said, while it is based in history, it informs the present and informs the future. So looking at after action reports to create something as small as like a little pamphlet, or we have a really great ongoing blog that are all based in primary research. Again, I can talk all day about how much I love my job.
Well, Dr. Haley's gonna give us the links for a lot of this stuff, at least all the
Absolutely.
public available stuff, so we can put it on our blog. But this after action thing keeps preying on my mind because so much of us who grew up in the late 60s and 70s sort of had this notion that, oh, the military's arrogant. They just do
Mm.
something and then they think they know what they're doing and they just go on and do the next thing. But in reality, they aren't. They're going back over their stuff and saying, what did we do wrong? Where do we make mistakes? As I say, the extent to which they do this is just astounding.
Yes, I recently wrote a piece on Liscum Bay, which was a vessel that sank in the Pacific, and it sank in 28 minutes. It sank very quickly. And one of the pieces to this, in terms of after action reports, is it's conducted very much like, I wouldn't say an interrogation, but in the sense of survivors of Liscum Bay, using that as an example. Survivors are encouraged not to talk to each other, only about the sinking, for example. So that way their stories don't necessarily become altered based off of what they've heard from someone else, right? And the reason they do this is so that way in the official after action report by the highest ranking surviving officer, can put everything together in a cohesive narrative and actually cite that ensign person witnessed this, which is how after 28 minutes, and then I want to say within about a month, the after action report was available, because of course the Navy wanted to know, why did the ship sink so fast, right? Well, come to find out, the ship itself was a converted civilian vessel, and they had stored, the Navy had stored the ordnance in not the greatest place. So when a
Uh-oh.
Japanese torpedo hit the vessel in the middle, it literally kind of cracked it. And so the part of the after action report discusses how men in the water saw the whole back of the ship just sink immediately. It also helps to explain why, when sailors are at battle stations, because in the Pacific War, when start of every day, because they were in a state of conflict, they were in conflict waters, every morning ships had battle stations, because that's the most likely time of day in which a ship could be fired upon by enemy torpedoes, which in this case happened. And so now we know, because of these after action reports, why there were so few survivors from the aft portion of the ship, because that was where the ordnance was stored. It exploded, it caught on fire, and there were any other number of things. And come to find out, it all comes down to technology and it being, the start of the war in the Pacific, and they wanted to get these ships out as quickly as possible by converting merchant ships.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in doing so, there are things, that little nuances in terms of using steel pipes instead of the iron that was on Liscum Bay, that changes things. Again, another reason why after action reports are so important in the moment is that tells at the time President Roosevelt that, okay, if we're going to modify merchant vessels, we need to change the iron piping to steel so that way it will hold up better.
Uh,
And then we also need to modify where we're going to place ordnance so that way, in the event of a torpedo hit, it doesn't immediately go up in flames and explode and it costs the lives of sailors. So,
yeah, it's just fascinating. Let me wrap things up by asking you this question. I know during your doctoral research and your specific scholarly research, you must have changed your mind about all kinds of things, and you found all kinds of misconceptions and things about military history. But what sort of big misconceptions have you come across for you and the general public in the work that you're doing as a historian for the Navy? In other words, all the time, relatives at Thanksgiving say, hey, well, you must know whether Pearl Harbor was a setup job and stuff like that. I'm not talking about that, but there must be some pretty big misconceptions or myths that you had in your mind that we would all have in our minds going into this job, that you find, oh, well, that's not the case at all. I used to think that, now I don't, because of my job, my day-to-day job.
right. Well, like I said, I came into this career. I do plan on sticking around for a while if they'll have me.
Well, until you reach the rank of admiral.
No, yeah, yeah. I wish. I can't think of any myth off the top of my head. Although if my coworkers were here who've, been employed with the Naval History and Heritage Command for, some have been there 10 years, some have been there for as long as I've been alive. So they probably know more than I do. But the one kind of nugget that I found in my research, to go back to radar for just a second, going through Admiral's papers, and some of the authors who have written on Guadalcanal have given us their research notes as well. So we have some of those records as well. And so I was flipping through someone's research notes and I saw a notation saying that there was concern at Guadalcanal that the Japanese would be on the same radar frequency. So that was why they turned off their radar. I say they as in the United States admirals turned off their radar because they feared that the Japanese would be on the same radar frequency and they would know where the ships were, the surface ships. And that was huge. It was only in one manuscript. So, as historians, we do like to see that kind of data from multiple sources, right? From different independent sources. But that was really interesting to me, that there was concern that the Japanese had radar. And then come to find out, this is where historians begin to talk to each other. There is a historian of Japanese technology, and he and I communicated through email. And I said, did the Japanese have radar in the fall of 1942? And he said, no, they didn't have radar until mid 1943. And even then, it wasn't that great. So, all of that is to say, while it's not necessarily a myth, it's those little nuggets of inspiration that just get you all excited about doing research, because come to find out, they were concerned. So, that may be one of the reasons why these admirals at Guadalcanal decided to turn their radar off.
There must have been people, if not in the scholarly community, in the sort of general community, because World War II is probably second only to the Civil War in having the most buffs per square inch. People say, "Oh, well, these admirals, like idiots, they turned their radar off."
Right.
Or the idiot admiral who parked all the planes close to each other in Pearl Harbor. Well, you're able to find out
Mhm.
there were reasons for that, and they had good reasons to think that, well, if they thought the Japanese had radar
Right.
and might be on the same frequency, then actually making the best decision they could make.
Right. And that's the other piece to it, right? Is we're not making judgments what happened in the past. We're just bringing data to the state of the fleet currently, so that way, in their best estimations, in whatever situations they may find themselves in, they might be able to reflect back and say, oh, well, this is what they anticipated at Guadalcanal. How can we prevent Guadalcanal Part 2? So, all of that is to say, that's one of the things I love about my job, is that, like, my work not only influences academia, because I there's a number of World War II Pacific historians in the area that I've been able to chat with and collaborate with, and even kind of debate over topics like this. Because again, I'm new, I'm fresh to this topic, but that's not to say that they're opposed to the idea that perhaps the admirals at Guadalcanal were anti-radar. It was just that perhaps they were concerned that the Japanese knew where they were and they wanted to prevent that.
Well, I hope at the very least what we've done with this episode, Dr. Haley, is shown for your enthusiasm, comes shining through. I kind of wish we had a video podcast so everyone could see how enthusiastic you are, but they could certainly hear how enthusiastic you are. That, we can say to young people in college who might be interested in history as a profession, and who might be thinking, oh, but there are only so many professor jobs open, and there's so few, and it's such a rat race, and that there are tons of government and also organizational historians out there.
Absolutely.
There's a huge career track like this,
Absolutely.
and most people don't know it.
Yes, the website is usajobs.org, and I like to pay it forward. I've had so many people involved in my progress and trajectory, both as a grad student, as a PhD student, as a candidate, and then as an early career professional, that I do truly want to pay that forward. So, should you have someone contact you that is interested in quote government service, I'm happy to respond and give what little nuggets of knowledge I have. But again, I have so many colleagues who work for the National Park Service as historians, not just as the out there giving tours, but they actually do research on site with the sources they have available to them. And of course, being so close to DC, there's also Smithsonian has their own historians. So there's any number of directions you could go with federal service, but definitely don't discount state and local historians as well. I did my master's degree in Texas. I had a minor in public history, and so I did a number of those historical markers on the side of the road. Texas has a wonderful historical commission that again is a state funded entity, and so because Texas loves its history.
Yeah, well, Texas loves Texas.
Yes.
So
But all of that is to say, for those who may feel discouraged by the academic job market, please, please, please do not discount historian work, because it varies so much.
and well, I mean, in big nonprofits, the United Nations, intergovernmental agencies, even huge corporations. I've been told General Motors has historians,
Yeah.
and on and on and on. So it's all out there, and I think, again, your enthusiasm for this work, Dr. Haley, is really going to provide a lot of our listeners with some new thinking. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Professor Buzzkill.
And we will talk to all the buzzkillers out there next week.